One guest checked into room 17, but never checked out. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your stories make this community alive. Now, let's open the door. It was a wet and bitterly cold evening when the word first reached St. Mary Mead. The express from London had been delayed by nearly an hour, though that hardly mattered to Miss Marple, who sat contentedly by her fire with her knitting. It was only when young Inspector Crail, fresh-faced and rather eager to impress, appeared at her door with his hat still dripping rain, that she looked up with polite surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, in the way policemen sometimes do when they're not quite sure whether they are addressing a respected consultant or an elderly aunt. "We've had a bit of a situation at the Crown Hotel in Market Chipping. Room 17, to be exact. I shouldn't like to trouble you, but—" He hesitated, glancing down at the puddle forming on her mat. Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "A bit of a situation," she repeated gently. "And you thought of me?" "That was kind of you, Inspector. I trust it's not a matter of misplaced towels." "No, ma'am. A locked room, and a dead man. Quite dead, I'm afraid. There's something odd about it. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and yet—" His voice trailed away. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "You know, Inspector, I've often observed that locked doors are most misleading. Shall we go at once?" The Crown Hotel was not particularly grand, but it had a certain faded dignity about it. The brass sign out front gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and the air was thick with the smell of damp carpet and old smoke. Room 17 was on the first floor, at the far end of a narrow hallway lined with patterned wallpaper that had once been fashionable. The door to room 17 stood closed, guarded by a constable. Crail produced a key, and together they stepped inside. The room itself was unremarkable. A double bed neatly made, a writing desk, a single armchair by the window, but on the bed, quite still, lay the body of a man in a grey suit. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and an air of quiet respectability. Miss Marple moved closer, her step soft and careful. The man's face bore no trace of violence, no bruises, no marks, save for a faint line just beneath the jaw, as if something had pressed there briefly. On the bedside table was a small glass of sherry, untouched, and on the writing desk, beside an ink blotter and a sheaf of hotel stationery, lay a single curious object, a playing card, the 7 of clubs. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, as if speaking to herself. Crail followed her gaze. "That was there when we arrived. The staff swear they didn't touch a thing. We've no idea what it means. His name's Mr. Henry Felton, traveling salesman, came in on the afternoon train. No. Visitors recorded. No sign of anyone entering or leaving the room after he checked in. And here's the worst of it. The door was locked from the inside. Windows shut fast, too. There's just no way anyone could have got in or out." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind ticked over as quietly as the clock on the mantelpiece. "Locks can be such friendly little things, Inspector," she murmured. "So obliging to the right sort of person." They spoke with the hotel manager, a pale, anxious man who wrung his hands continually. "A dreadful business," he said. Mr. Felton was a quiet guest, kept to himself. He dined early, roast lamb and potatoes, and went up to his room about 8. No one saw him after that. The maid brought his morning tea at 7:30, but got no reply. We had to open the door with the spare key. That's when we found—" He gestured helplessly. "And no one heard anything during the night?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "Nothing at all, madam. Well, except—" He hesitated. "Yes? A strange thing, now I think of it. The gentleman in room 15 mentioned hearing a sort of thump just before midnight, but nothing more. He thought perhaps someone had dropped a suitcase." Miss Marple inclined her head as though such details were most ordinary. She asked to see Mr. Felton's belongings, which had been placed neatly in a suitcase on the luggage rack. Clothing folded with precision, a shaving kit, receipts for various small purchases in London. Nothing unusual, until she noticed a faint smear of something on the cuff of his white shirt. She leaned closer. It was hardly visible, a pale brownish smudge, almost the color of... Her mind supplied it before her words did. She straightened slowly, saying nothing for the moment. The inspector had been pacing the room. "It doesn't add up," he said at last. "No forced entry. No weapon. A playing card that means nothing, and a perfectly healthy man found dead in a locked room. We've sent for the doctor, of course, but I can't see how this could be anything but impossible." Miss Marple gave him a gentle, almost grandmotherly smile. "Impossible things," she said, "have a way of being really quite ordinary, once you understand them. I think, Inspector, that it might be useful to speak with the chambermaid. People in her position see more than they know." The maid, a timid young woman named Alice, seemed startled by the attention. "I didn't see anything, miss. Well, I did notice the doorknob on room 17 felt a bit sticky-like. Last night when I took up his hot water, thought nothing of it." "Sticky," Miss Marple repeated gently. "And what time would that have been?" "About 9:30, miss. I set the jug down and he said thank you, very polite. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched faintly at her side. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "You've been very helpful." As they stepped back into the corridor, Crail looked at her with bafflement. "Sticky doorknobs, thumps in the night, and a playing card. If there's a connection, I can't see it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a moment on the plain wooden door of room 17. "Connections," she murmured, "are very like the threads in a bit of old lace. At first they seem quite tangled, but if you're patient, you find they lead exactly where they're meant to." Her eyes were bright now, and there was a faint, knowing satisfaction in her expression. She had seen just enough to suspect the pattern beneath the surface, but she would say nothing more. Not yet. There was still the matter of how Mr. Henry Felton came to be lying dead in a room that no one could possibly have entered. Or so everyone thought, and as she turned back toward the stairwell, she could not help but think of that 7 of clubs, lying silent on the desk like a message written in a language only the right person would understand. Miss Marple did not hurry. She had learned long ago that people revealed themselves best when given time, and that rushing about rarely made things any clearer. Inspector Crail, however, was full of official purpose, sending the constable for statements, ordering photographs of the scene, and speaking in low tones to the hotel manager. Miss Marple stood quietly by the narrow corridor window, her gaze drifting across the rain-slicked street below. It was a small market town, and life went on in spite of death. Shopkeepers bolting shutters, a boy hurrying home with a loaf under his arm, the postman taking shelter in the doorway of the tobacconist's. Everything was ordinary, yet that was what made the oddness of room 17 stand out all the more. She drifted back into the room, moving as if to examine the pattern of the wallpaper, though her eyes were on the desk. The 7 of clubs still lay there, untouched. The edges were faintly worn, as if from handling. It was not a new card, yet there was no deck in the room, nor any suggestion that Mr. Felton had been playing. Her gloved fingers hovered over it a moment, but she left it where it lay. Crail came in again, shaking his head. "No luck." Staff confirmed no one came up after 8. Guests in adjoining rooms noticed nothing suspicious. "We'll have the doctor's report in the morning, but for now, no sign of poisoning, no marks of violence. It's as if he just stopped." Miss Marple nodded mildly, then looked toward the bed. "It's a curious thing," she said softly, "how people leave rooms behind them. I always think you can tell a great deal about a person by how they live in a space, even for a night. This room is very tidy." Perhaps too tidy for a traveling salesman. Crail frowned. You think someone else might have arranged it? Not necessarily. Only that tidiness is sometimes a disguise, like politeness. It tells us something, though perhaps not. What we expect. She moved to the wardrobe, which stood ajar. Inside hung a single grey overcoat, a neat but inexpensive garment. On the floor beneath it sat a pair of well-polished shoes, one slightly more worn at the sole than the other. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the shoes, her brow faintly furrowed, before she turned back to the desk. It was then that she noticed the hotel notepad. The top sheet was blank, but faint indentations marred the paper beneath. Without touching it, she looked to Crail. "Inspector, I wonder, might you have a pencil to hand?" Puzzled, he handed one over. She slipped a sheet of paper beneath the top page and gently rubbed the side of the pencil across the surface. Slowly, faint writing appeared, a few scattered words, and beneath them, a number. 7, Crail read aloud. And then, club, and a telephone number. What on earth? Miss Marple replaced the pencil delicately. It's rather obliging of people to press so hard when they write, isn't it? Though, of course, one wonders why our Mr. Felton, or someone else, should write such a thing on hotel stationery and then remove the sheet. Before the inspector could answer, the door opened again, and a tall, well-dressed woman entered, her face pale, but her manner composed. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clara Talbot, a guest staying 2 doors down. "I heard about the dreadful business," she said, her voice carefully pitched. "I wondered if I might be of any help. I saw Mr. Felton briefly yesterday, you know. Such a quiet man." Miss Marple's eyes took her in without a trace of rudeness. The expensive gloves, the faint scent of violets, the little smudge at the hem of her skirt where mud had dried. "So kind of you, Mrs. Talbot. Did you happen to notice anything unusual last night?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward Crail before answering. "No, nothing at all. I went to bed early. These old hotels can be so drafty. I scarcely slept. But I certainly didn't hear anything out of the ordinary." Her manner was perfectly polite, yet Miss Marple noticed the slight twitch of her fingers on her gloves as if she were resisting the urge to tug them off. And that smudge at the hem. It was a detail most would overlook, but to Miss Marple it spoke of someone who had been outside recently, perhaps later than she claimed. Mrs. Talbot excused herself after a few polite questions, and the inspector turned to Miss Marple. "You don't believe her?" "My dear inspector, I've learned it is a great mistake to say one does or doesn't believe people, but I do observe that she has mud on her skirt on a night when she claims she went to bed early. That is not belief, it is merely fact." Crail gave a half smile despite himself. "You do have a way of noticing things. Still, mud on a skirt doesn't make her a murderer." "No," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "But little things, mud, a card, a number on a piece of paper, they have a way of coming together. One simply has to be patient enough to let the pattern show itself." As they stepped back into the corridor, another figure appeared. A young porter, hurrying along with a message for the inspector. "Beg pardon, sir," he said breathlessly. "This just came down from the station. They found a parcel left in the cloakroom last night. It's addressed to Mr. Henry Felton, but there's no sender's name." Crail's brows rose. "We'd better have it brought here at once." The porter returned a short while later with a small brown paper package, neatly wrapped and tied with string. There was nothing remarkable about it until the inspector opened it and revealed its contents. Inside lay a single item, another playing card, the 7 of clubs. Crail swore softly under his breath. 2 of them now. What in blazes is this supposed to mean? Miss Marple looked at the card, her expression as mild as ever. But there was a sharpness in her eyes now, as though she were fitting together the edges of a puzzle only she could see. She said nothing for the moment, instead turning her attention to the narrow hallway, where a draught seemed to come from somewhere it should not. Her gaze lingered on the skirting board beneath the window, noting how the dust lay undisturbed everywhere except for a small patch just beside the radiator. She said nothing, only stepped closer, her hand trailing lightly along the wall as though admiring the old plaster work. The inspector followed her look. "What is it? You see something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet, Inspector, but I think we shall very soon. The thing about mysteries is that they tend to be rather like curtains. They seem very thick and impenetrable at first, but when one looks closely—" She let her fingers rest just at the point where the dust was disturbed. "One finds the tiniest gap through which the truth begins to show." She straightened, her expression almost serene. "I should like very much to speak again with Mrs. Talbot, and perhaps with whoever last cleaned this room before Mr. Felton arrived. I think, Inspector, we are beginning to see the edges of our picture." Her tone was mild, almost conversational, yet there was a quiet certainty beneath it. Something in room 17 was out of place, not in a way that shouted for attention, but in the small, deliberate manner that Miss Marple knew better than anyone could be the difference between an ordinary death and a very deliberate murder. Miss Marple had always said that people revealed more in conversation than they realized. The trick was never to press too hard, just enough to let their own words trip them. That afternoon, the little lounge of the Crown Hotel became her stage, with Inspector Crail watching from the side, sometimes impatient, sometimes baffled, as she worked through the tangle of voices. The first to be brought in was Mrs. Clara Talbot. She entered, gracefully, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she had rehearsed this moment. "I do hope I can be of some help," she began, her tone smooth. "Such a dreadful business. I can't think why anyone would want to harm Mr. Felton. I scarcely knew him." Miss Marple tilted her head kindly. "You must have crossed paths in the corridor, perhaps, or at dinner." "Oh, perhaps once or twice," Mrs. Talbot replied with a quick smile. "He seemed perfectly ordinary. We dined at separate tables." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I always think dining arrangements can be so telling. You didn't speak to him at all?" "Not beyond a polite greeting. I went to bed early, as I said before. I'm afraid I was rather tired after the journey." Miss Marple nodded, her expression as mild as ever. But she noticed the woman's fingers twisting her gloves again, that faint tremor of tension. "And yet," she said lightly, "it was a muddy night. I wonder you weren't tempted to take a turn in the garden before retiring. It can be quite refreshing after a long train ride." Mrs. Talbot's eyes flickered. "The garden? Oh, no. I wouldn't go out in that weather. Terribly unpleasant. No, I stayed in my room." Miss Marple smiled sweetly, as though the matter were settled. But she caught Inspector Crail's glance. He, too, had noticed the neat lie. Next came Mr. Leonard Price, the guest from room 15, the man who had heard the thump. He was in his early 50s, with a pinched face and a nervous air, as though afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said hastily. "Just a sound, that's all. Around midnight, maybe a little before. Could have been anything. A suitcase falling, a door slamming. I thought nothing of it till this morning." Miss Marple regarded him with kindly patience. "You were awake quite late then? Not a light sleeper, I hope?" "Oh, I'm often awake," Price admitted, rubbing his thin hands together. "The train's passing at night, you know. They keep a fellow up. I'm here on business, rather dull. I read a bit before turning in. Didn't see or hear anything else unusual, I swear." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but she noticed the sweat on his temple, the slight hesitation when he mentioned business. "And you didn't speak to Mr. Felton at any point?" Price shook his head vigorously. No. I may have seen him in the lobby. That's all." "Indeed. Well, thank you, Mr. Price. You've been most helpful." As he left, Crail muttered, "He's nervous as a cat." But that doesn't mean guilt. Could just be the police make him uneasy. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I've always thought that the truth sits comfortably on the shoulders, whereas falsehoods tend to itch. The next to appear was Alice, the chambermaid. She entered timidly, her hands twisting her apron. "I've told all I know, miss. Mr. Felton was polite. Nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And yet you noticed the doorknob to room 17 felt sticky the night before. That is a curious thing, don't you think?" Alice's eyes widened. "Oh, I didn't mean... It was just... Sometimes the polish leaves a tacky feel is all. I didn't think anything of it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a gentle murmur. "But the polish hadn't been used on any of the other doors that day, had it?" Alice bit her lip, uncertain. "No, miss. Only, well, sometimes Mr. Porter from maintenance. He sees to little things like that. I didn't see him last night, though." "Mr. Porter?" "Aye, miss. John Porter. He's about the place most evenings. Knows all the rooms and locks." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Crail, who scribbled the name down. Porter was sent for and arrived in his work coat, smelling faintly of linseed oil. He was a stocky man with shrewd eyes. "Terrible thing what happened," he said at once. "I was just saying to my wife this morning, never had trouble in this hotel before. Now all the police about disrupts everything." "You have a key to all the rooms, I presume?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Porter looked at her narrowly. "Course. Standard procedure, but I didn't go near 17 last night." "No call, too?" "Not even to see about a sticky doorknob." He frowned. "Sticky? I don't know what that girl's talking about. I didn't touch that door." Miss Marple smiled gently, as though the matter were nothing at all, but she noticed the faint smear of something brownish on his cuff, a shade not unlike the smudge she had seen on Mr. Felton's shirt. As he left, Crail muttered, "Too many coincidences in this place, but there's no proof, just bits and pieces." "Bits and pieces," Miss Marple agreed. "That's how most things begin." Finally, the hotel manager, Mr. Green, was called in. His anxiety had only grown throughout the day. "I hope this will all be settled quickly," he said, dabbing at his forehead. "The Crown has a reputation to uphold." Miss Marple's tone was kindly, but her eyes were keen. "You had no quarrel with Mr. Felton? No reason to wish him harm?" "Good heavens, no. A paying guest, quiet and polite. Why, he even paid in advance." "That is unusual, isn't it? Most guests pay upon departure." The manager hesitated, flustered. "Well, perhaps, but I saw nothing suspicious. He said he might have to leave early in the morning and didn't want to be delayed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How thoughtful of him. And you, of course, were here all evening?" "Yes, of course. In my office. I retire at 10:30 every night without fail." "Such regular habits," Miss Marple murmured. "I imagine it must have been quite a shock to find the constable knocking on your door in the morning." Green swallowed, nodding, quickly. "Terrible shock. When he left, Crail exhaled heavily. Every one of them's hiding something. We've got half a dozen little lies, but nothing we can tie together." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap as she regarded the closed door. "Lies are like threads, Inspector. Separate, they don't amount to much. But weave them together, and one begins to see the shape of the cloth. I think we are very close to knowing what that cloth is meant to be." Her eyes strayed once more to the corridor where room 17 stood silent. Somewhere in those voices, polite, nervous, evasive, lay the truth, and it was beginning to hum faintly, like a kettle just before it boils. Miss Marple often said that human motives were rarely tidy things. They tangled like the wool in her knitting basket, with strands of jealousy, greed, and fear knotted together so tightly that one could scarcely tell where one began and the other ended. In the quiet of the Crown Hotel's small lounge, she began the slow work of teasing those threads apart. Inspector Crail was pacing again, a frown pulling his eyebrows low. "We've got too many loose ends, Miss Marple. Every one of them had opportunity in some way, and every one of them is lying about something." but none of it adds up to a murder that makes sense. Perhaps it is not the murder that makes sense, but the people, Miss Marple said mildly. Crimes are rarely tidy affairs, Inspector. They tend to grow from the soil of human weakness. She began reviewing what they knew, speaking almost as though to herself. Mrs. Talbot, for instance. She claims to have no acquaintance with Mr. Felton, and yet her gloves are new, not the sort one buys for a long country stay, but for a specific occasion. She had reason to avoid being seen in the garden, though I dare say she was there. What business might she have had outdoors at such an hour, I wonder? Crail muttered. Could be she met Felton there. But why? Old acquaintance, an affair, blackmail. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Possibly, but she is the sort of woman who fears scandal above all else. If Felton knew something compromising, well, that might explain her unease. But let us not leap too far ahead. She shifted her gaze toward the notes about Leonard Price. Mr. Price's nerves are most interesting. Not the nerves of a man hiding violence, I think, but of one concealing some less dangerous truth. He claims to be here on business, and yet his shoes show no sign of travel beyond the hotel and station. One wonders what sort of business keeps a man restless at night, pacing by a window where he might overhear more than he intends. Could be just a liar, Crail said with a shrug. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Lies are rarely without reason. Sometimes a man lies to protect his own pride, sometimes to protect someone else. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she spoke. And then there is Alice, the chambermaid. She is frightened, but not of us. That is an important distinction. Her mention of the sticky doorknob was not an invention. It was a slip. She knows more of the hotel's comings and goings than she dares to say. Someone has warned her to keep quiet. Crail leaned forward. You think Porter? He's the one with access to everything. Porter has opportunity, certainly. His cuff shows a smear of some substance that might prove interesting, but his motive. Maintenance men are rarely sentimental about guests. If he had reason, it would be something quite practical. Money, perhaps, or a debt of loyalty to someone else. Crail made a note, though his frown deepened. And the manager, Green, seems more worried about the hotel's reputation than anything else. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, which in itself can be a powerful motive. A scandal could ruin the crown, but why pay Felton in advance? That was Felton's idea, I think, not Green's. And yet Green was nervous when asked about it. Did he suspect that Felton might not be leaving in the ordinary way? Crail looked at her sharply. You think Green knew something would happen? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that Green knew something about Felton. Enough to fear trouble, perhaps, but not enough to intervene. She let the silence settle for a moment before continuing. Felton himself is the key. We know very little of him. A man traveling alone, paying in advance, staying only a night or two. What sort of man behaves so? A man avoiding notice, perhaps, or one expecting danger. If we knew more of his purpose here, the motives of the others might become clearer. Crail rubbed the back of his neck. Could be blackmail, could be a business deal gone wrong, could be, well, any number of things. Indeed, Miss Marple said. That is why we must look at the smaller patterns. Notice that each person's account avoids mentioning another directly. Mrs. Talbot claims to know nothing of Price. Price says nothing of Talbot. Alice avoids mentioning Porter except by necessity. Porter denies even touching a door that Alice insists was tampered with. And Green? He says nothing of any of them. It's a web, Crail muttered. A web of mutual avoidance, Miss Marple agreed. Which suggests that each has some connection to the others, however slight, and each fears that connection will come to light. She paused, considering, if I may, Inspector, it might be prudent to learn more of Mr. Felton's past. There may be threads tying these people to him that are not immediately apparent. Crail sighed, but there was a glimmer of reluctant respect in his eyes. I'll see what we can dig up, In the meantime, where does that leave us?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking again. "It leaves us with a tangle of possible motives. Blackmail for Mrs. Talbot, concealment for Mr. Price, fear for Alice, self-preservation for Mr. Porter, and reputation for Mr. Green. Alone, none of these is quite enough. But together—" She looked toward the closed corridor, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Together, they may form a pattern, and patterns, Inspector, are rarely accidental." As evening fell over the Crown Hotel, the suspects kept to their rooms, the atmosphere thick with unease. Each, Miss Marple knew, was hoping the matter would resolve without their own secrets coming to light. But secrets had a way of working themselves free, just as the pattern in her knitting always emerged, stitch by stitch, and she was beginning to see the faint outline of something in the weave, a motive not entirely of greed, nor revenge, nor fear, but something far more intricate, binding each of them more closely to Felton's fate than they would dare to admit. The rain had begun again, tapping steadily against the windows of the Crown Hotel when the so-called breakthrough arrived. It came not from patient questioning, nor from any particularly clever police work, but from a chambermaid's casual discovery. Alice, pale and trembling, had burst into the lounge where Inspector Crail sat with a tepid cup of tea. "Sir, it's Mr. Porter's coat. In the laundry cupboard. There's blood on the sleeve." Within minutes, the coat was produced. A rough workman's jacket, worn at the elbows, but unmistakably stained along the cuff with a rusty brown that looked far too much like dried blood. Crail straightened with new purpose. "That's it. We've got him. Access to all the rooms, lied about touching the doors, and now this. I'll have him in cuffs before the hour's out." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, merely looked up. "How interesting," she murmured. "And yet, Inspector, I can't help feeling we must ask ourselves one or two little questions." But Crail was already striding away, the coat held as though it were the crown jewel of the case. Porter was fetched from his workshop, confusion written plainly on his face. "Blood? On my coat? That's ridiculous. I've been painting the new skirting in the dining room. That's linseed and varnish, not—" But the police were in no mood to listen. A quick test at the local surgery confirmed the substance was indeed blood, though they could not yet say whether it was human. That small detail was drowned in the excitement of an apparent resolution. By late afternoon, Porter was in custody. Crail returned to the lounge, looking almost relieved. "That's one for the books, Miss Marple. Open and shut. The man's been shifty from the start. He'll confess before morning." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression perfectly mild. "It must be a great comfort to feel a case is neatly tied up, though I can't help but think of Mrs. Weatherby's unfortunate incident with the missing ham." Crail frowned. "What in blazes has a ham got to do with it?" "Well, you see," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "the poor woman was quite certain her nephew had stolen it. She found the empty wrapping in his room, and the boy had always been fond of a hearty breakfast. But it turned out the dog had buried it in the garden. Appearances can be so dreadfully misleading." Crail groaned. "You're saying Porter's innocent?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied gently, "that the presence of blood on his cuff is curious, certainly, but not quite as damning as it appears. A man in his position handles any number of minor injuries, broken glass, nails, perhaps even a guest who cuts themselves and calls for assistance, and the coat was found in a place quite accessible to anyone. Far too accessible, in fact, if one wanted to plant something there." Crail hesitated, irritation flickering in his eyes. "You think someone planted it to frame him?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that the swiftness of the discovery is suspicious. We have a death that has been most carefully contrived to appear impossible. And now, just when suspicion might begin to settle uncomfortably on other shoulders, we are handed a most convenient culprit." Crail rubbed the back of his neck. "So you'd have me keep digging?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I shouldn't dream of interfering with official matters." but I dare say you will sleep better when all the threads are tied to the proper places, rather than knotted hastily in the middle. That evening, the hotel's atmosphere shifted. Guests whispered over supper. Staff moved about in uneasy silence. Mrs. Talbot was seen speaking in low tones to Mr. Price in a shadowed corner, both glancing toward the door as though afraid of being overheard. The manager, Mr. Green, was uncharacteristically cheerful, telling anyone who would listen that the dreadful business was all but over. Miss Marple noticed these things. She also noticed that Alice the maid seemed more nervous than ever, avoiding her gaze entirely. And she noticed the faintest sense of relief in the air, as though a storm had passed, yet the clouds outside had not cleared at all. After supper, she took a slow walk down the corridor past room 17. The door was shut, the constable stationed nearby looking bored, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the skirting board, where a faint smear of something dark had been hastily scrubbed. Not varnish, not dust. Something wiped away in haste and missed. Returning to her chair in the lounge, she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. To Crail, who came by with a weary air, she said nothing of the smear. Not yet. "I've spoken to the prosecutor," Crail said heavily. "If Porter doesn't confess, they'll charge him anyway. We've got enough to take it to court." Miss Marple's eyes remained on her knitting. "And yet," she said mildly, "I fear the real murderer may be very much at liberty. A false victory, Inspector, is no victory at all." Somewhere in the quiet halls of the Crown Hotel, she knew the real criminal was waiting. Not to strike again, at least not yet, but to watch the investigation tie itself neatly into a bow around the wrong man. And that, she thought, was the most dangerous moment of all. The rain had deepened into a steady curtain by the next morning, casting the Crown Hotel into a grey, damp hush. Most guests lingered in their rooms, emerging only for tea or cautious glances at the newspaper stand in the lobby, where news of Porter's arrest had already been printed in bold type. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the lounge, her knitting resting on her lap. She was not watching the rain, nor the paper, but the comings and goings in the hall. Alice the maid passed twice, carrying linen to rooms that had no occupants. Mrs. Talbot descended the stairs, looking flustered, only to retreat again when she saw Leonard Price speaking with Mr. Green in low, urgent tones. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The pattern was forming, but it was not about the death of Mr. Felton alone. That afternoon, as Inspector Crail lingered nearby, she rose and approached the front desk with apparent absent-mindedness. "Mr. Green," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity. I seem to remember reading something years ago about a rather dreadful business in a coastal town. Brighton, I think it was. And Mr. Felton was involved in a matter concerning forged accounts. That wouldn't happen to be the same Mr. Felton, would it?" Green's face tightened almost imperceptibly before he forced a smile. "I wouldn't know about that, Miss Marple. We don't make a habit of digging into guests' pasts here." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. "One wouldn't want unpleasantness, though it is curious, isn't it? A man pays in advance, travels alone, keeps to himself, and then, well, I suppose it's nothing." But she saw the flicker in Green's eyes. Not fear, precisely, but recognition. Later, while Crail was dealing with paperwork, Miss Marple excused herself to fetch her book, and instead took a deliberate stroll past the writing desk in the reading room. There, among the old hotel registers neatly stacked in a cabinet, she saw what she suspected might be the key. The Crown Hotel had prided itself on keeping meticulous records, guests, events, notable occasions. She remembered an idle remark from Alice 2 days earlier. It's strange, seeing her here again after all this time. Her fingers brushed over the spines until she found the ledger from 7 years ago. Opening it, she scanned the names with careful precision, and there it was. 2 names, entered only 3 days apart. Mrs. Eleanor Talbot and Edward Felton. Her mouth tightened. At supper that evening, Miss Marple resumed her seat in the lounge just as Price passed by. She looked up mildly. "Such dreadful weather. It reminds me of that business at Brighton, you know. The one involving forged accounts. Curious, I was told Mr. Felton once travelled in company with a Mr. Leonard Price, though it might have been another gentleman entirely." Price froze. His jaw tightened, but he gave a thin smile. "I think you must be mistaken. I don't make a habit of travelling with strangers, or of getting involved in their affairs." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, returning to her knitting. But she saw the way his hand trembled as he adjusted his cuff. That night she pieced the threads together in her mind. The Brighton affair had been quietly buried. No official scandal, but several reputations ruined. Felton had escaped prosecution, but he had made enemies. Mrs. Talbot's name, she recalled, had been whispered in connection with an investment that went awry. Price's former post as a junior accountant had ended abruptly around the same time, and Green, the hotel manager, had been a clerk at a small bank in the same district, one that closed under suspicious circumstances. The past was not merely an echo. It was the soil from which this present crime had grown. The next morning, she met Crail in the lounge, where he was nursing a coffee. "Inspector," she said gently, "I wonder if we might consider that Mr. Felton's death is not merely an isolated incident. He had acquaintances here, acquaintances with reason to dislike him. The threads go back several years." Crail frowned. "You're saying all of them, Talbot, Price, Green, they all knew Felton before?" "Not just knew him," Miss Marple said. "They were bound together by an unfortunate series of events in Brighton. Mr. Felton seems to have prospered at their expense. That is not the sort of thing people easily forget." Crail muttered something under his breath, then looked at her sharply. "If you're right, that changes everything. It means Porter's arrest was a false comfort," Miss Marple finished. "Convenient, yes, but entirely disconnected from the real motive. The past, Inspector, has a way of creeping into the present. One must always be careful where old grudges lie." As she spoke, she glanced toward the corridor where Mrs. Talbot was descending the stairs again, her face pale, her step uncertain. Price was in the lounge, avoiding her eyes, and Green, behind the desk, was watching them both with the wary gaze of a man who knows his own past is no longer safe. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes never leaving the three of them. The roots of the crime were deep, tangled, and very old. But she had spent a lifetime unpicking such knots, and soon, she knew, one careless move from any of them would cause the whole tangle to unravel. The rain had thinned to a mist the next morning, and the air inside the Crown Hotel was tense and watchful. Word of Porter's arrest had not quite eased the unease. If anything, it had made the atmosphere brittle, as though the slightest sound might shatter it. Miss Marple, however, seemed perfectly at ease as she took her tea in the lounge. Her knitting lay neatly folded beside her, and in her lap rested a small envelope, one that no one else seemed to notice. Inspector Crail approached, his brow furrowed. "I've made inquiries in Brighton," he said in a low voice. "You were right. Felton's name was tied to that business with the bank failure, and Price, Talbot, and Green, they were all involved in one way or another, but there's nothing to prove any of them were in the room that night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, but my dear Inspector, we are not looking for someone who was in the room. We are looking for someone who wanted us to think they were not." Crail gave her a puzzled look, but Miss Marple did not elaborate. Instead, she rose, walked to the front desk, and addressed Mr. Green with her usual gentle courtesy. "Mr. Green, you've been so kind to us all during this unfortunate business. I do hate to trouble you, but I've found a little envelope, and I believe it must belong to one of the guests. Would you be so good as to ask everyone to step in for just a moment? I should like to see if it finds its rightful owner." Green hesitated, his polite smile faltering just slightly. Of course, Miss Marple, if you think it necessary. Within a quarter hour, the principal figures had gathered. Mrs. Talbot, pale and tense. Mr. Price, outwardly composed but with a sheen of perspiration at his temple. Green himself, watchful behind the desk. Even Alice hovered at the doorway, wringing her hands. Miss Marple placed the small envelope on the table. You see, it's the strangest thing. It contains nothing of value. Just a scrap of paper with a word written on it. A single word. Brighton. The room seemed to tighten around the sound. Mrs. Talbot's lips pressed together. Price's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Green's hand, resting on the desk, curled slightly inward. I wondered, Miss Marple continued gently, whether anyone might know how such a thing came to be lying in the corridor outside room 17. I'm sure it's nothing of consequence, though people do so dislike their private papers being misplaced. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Talbot spoke, her voice brittle. It means nothing. Brighton is a place. A great many people go there. Quite true, Miss Marple said, though it is curious how certain places become rather charged in the memory. Seaside holiday, or a failed investment, or a small scandal. Such things do leave impressions, don't they? Price's gaze flickered sharply toward Green at that, and Miss Marple saw it. The brief, unguarded glance of a man whose alibi is not as solid as he claims. She smiled pleasantly, as though she had noticed nothing at all. Well, it seems no one will claim it. Perhaps it will have to remain a mystery. Crail looked baffled as the group dispersed, each with an air of strained composure. What in blazes was that supposed to do? He muttered. Miss Marple resumed her seat. Oh, nothing at all, Inspector, except that our guilty party could not help glancing toward an old associate when the past came to the surface. You see, deception is a fragile thing. A word from the past, dropped at just the right moment, can make even the most careful person forget themselves for half a second, and half a second is all one needs. Crail frowned. So Price, then? Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, my dear Inspector. Not yet. He is afraid, certainly, but not of being caught for murder. The glance was instinctive, but not incriminating in itself. What it tells us is that there is still a secret being shared. And secrets, you know, are far more revealing than confessions. She looked toward the staircase, where Mrs. Talbot was retreating quickly to her room. And I believe, she added softly, that we are very close indeed to the heart of the matter. Would you like me to move straight into the next stage, where Miss Marple begins her final maneuver and setting a quiet but decisive trap to force the murderer into revealing themselves? This is where the tension will peak. You said, the vanishing evidence, 1,000 to 1,200 words. Just when the case gains momentum, a crucial piece of evidence is stolen, destroyed, or altered. Someone is working against the detective, trying to bury the truth before it can be uncovered. The stakes rise, and trust becomes a fragile thing. ChatGPT said, the next morning broke with an uneasy brightness, the kind that seemed to throw the faded carpets and worn edges of the Crown Hotel into sharper relief. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window in the lounge, knitting needles clicking softly as the first guests trickled past. But she was not looking at her stitches. Her eyes occasionally drifted toward the front desk, specifically to the locked cabinet where Inspector Crail had placed the physical evidence. The Brighton envelope, retrieved from outside room 17, had been secured there the night before along with a small notebook of Felton's that Crail had found behind a radiator in the corridor. That notebook, written in Felton's cramped, precise hand, might have been nothing, or it might have contained the single thread that could unravel everything. But at 10 o'clock, when Crail went to retrieve it, the key turned in the lock and his expression changed at once. It's gone, he muttered, his voice low and taut. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Gone, Inspector. The notebook and the envelope. Both of them." He looked toward Green, who hovered a few paces away with a strained politeness. "Who's had access to this cabinet?" Green straightened, bristling. "Only myself and your constable, Inspector. But I've been at the desk all morning." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was quietly sorting possibilities. "My dear Mr. Green, keys have a way of multiplying when secrets are involved. One never knows how many hands might have held them over the years." The discovery spread quickly. Price appeared at the desk within minutes, eyebrows raised in an expression just a touch too practiced. Mrs. Talbot descended soon after, her face pale, claiming she had heard a commotion. Even Alice lingered in the background, her nervous eyes darting between the inspector and the desk as though she knew more than she dared to say. Crail muttered under his breath. "This is bad. Whoever took that notebook knew exactly what it might contain, and they knew to move fast." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Talbot, who was standing just far enough away to appear detached, yet whose gloved hands twisted together with a restless tension. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "you may find it reassuring to know that whoever removed the notebook has also confirmed something for us. They have told us, in their haste, that there is indeed something worth hiding." Price's voice cut in, smooth but sharp-edged. "Unless, of course, someone took it to frame another person. You must admit, Inspector, these things happen. Evidence turns up or vanishes at very convenient moments." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, just for an instant. "Yes," she said softly, "that is quite true. And in my experience, those who bring up such possibilities so quickly are often rather well acquainted with the process." Price's smile froze, but he said nothing more. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the hotel was almost palpable. Crail's constable had turned up nothing in a search of the common rooms. Guests who might otherwise have lingered in the lounge now kept to their quarters, emerging only when necessary. Miss Marple, however, made her way up the stairs, pausing briefly outside room 17 before continuing down the corridor to a small alcove near the linen closet. There, she found Alice, bent over a pile of folded sheets. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you've seemed rather troubled these past few days. I do hope it isn't this dreadful business weighing on you." Alice's eyes darted to the side. "I don't want any trouble, ma'am. I just want to keep my job." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her voice kind, "you know something. I suspect you may have seen someone in the corridor this morning. Someone who didn't want to be seen." Alice hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "I saw Mr. Price near the desk early on. He said he was looking for his bill, but Mr. Green wasn't there yet. He had something in his hand when he left. I didn't see what." Miss Marple nodded slightly, not in triumph, but in confirmation. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." When she returned to the lounge, Crail was pacing. "If Price has it, he's not fool enough to keep it in his room. That notebook could be anywhere by now." Miss Marple's expression was serene, but there was a spark in her eyes. "Perhaps, Inspector, but sometimes when evidence vanishes, it does not go far. In my experience, the guilty often feel safer keeping it close. Too close. A thing hidden nearby can be recovered quickly if the need arises, and that tells us something very important indeed." Crail frowned. "That we're looking for someone confident enough to think they can keep it hidden?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles beginning to click once more. "Which, in this case, narrows our possibilities quite considerably." Her gaze slid almost imperceptibly toward the desk, where Green was carefully rearranging the mail rack with an unnecessary precision. Mrs. Talbot had disappeared again, and Price was nowhere in sight. The game, Miss Marple thought, had just entered its most delicate stage. Someone was working against her, and they had just raised the stakes. It was just after 9 that evening when the Crown Hotel's uneasy quiet was broken by a sudden clamor from the upper floor. A woman's scream cut through the stillness, high, sharp, and unmistakably terrified. Miss Marple, who had been calmly finishing her tea in the lounge, set down her cup at once. Inspector Crail, who had been hovering near the front desk, was already taking the stairs 2 at a time. The sound had come from the corridor near room 17. Guests emerged from their doors, some in dressing gowns, others peering nervously from the thresholds. At the far end of the hall stood Mrs. Talbot, her hand at her mouth, pointing toward the half-open door of room 19. Inside, the room was in disarray. Furniture shifted, a chair overturned, but what drew everyone's attention was the figure sprawled beside the bed. Mr. Price lay motionless, his complexion waxen, eyes half open as though caught in some terrible realization before death. Crail knelt at once, feeling for a pulse, but shook his head. Dead. Not long either. Something sudden. Poison, perhaps. The guests murmured in alarm, but Miss Marple's eyes were not on the body. She was scanning the room quietly, her gaze moving from the desk to the small washstand, to the half-empty glass on the bedside table. A hurried drink, she murmured softly. How very convenient. Green appeared in the doorway, pale and tight-lipped. Inspector, this is dreadful. Another death in my hotel? Crail stood, his voice sharp. No one leaves the premises. This isn't coincidence. Whoever's behind this is still here, and now they're desperate. Miss Marple moved closer to the overturned chair, kneeling just slightly. She brushed her fingers across the carpet, her expression thoughtful. A struggle, she said softly, but not one meant to save his life. One meant to keep something from being found. How curious. The tension in the hall was electric. Mrs. Talbot was weeping quietly into a handkerchief. Green was wringing his hands at the door. Alice had retreated behind the others, her eyes wide and fearful. Crail muttered darkly, "This changes everything." Whoever killed Felton wasn't finished. Price must have known something that put him in danger. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, her eyes drifting toward Mrs. Talbot. Or perhaps, Inspector, he had something that someone else wanted back. A small book, perhaps. One that has gone missing once already today. Mrs. Talbot's breath caught audibly, but she quickly looked away. Crail turned to Miss Marple. You think this was about the notebook? Miss Marple's expression was mild. I think, Inspector, that the loss of evidence often prompts hasty action. And hasty action, in my experience, is when mistakes are made. But we must be careful. Whoever is behind these events is not yet finished. They will act again if they feel cornered. The inspector nodded grimly, posting a constable at both ends of the corridor. Guests were ordered back to their rooms. The hallway quieted once more, but the air remained taut with the sense that the killer was moving somewhere unseen, still a step ahead. Later, in the lounge, Crail slumped into a chair. First Felton, now Price. Whoever this is, they're clever. They knew we were closing in. Miss Marple's knitting clicked softly. Yes, Inspector, and clever people are often most dangerous when they believe they are nearly caught. The question now is not merely who committed the first crime, but who is desperate enough to silence every possible whisper of truth before they themselves are silenced by justice. Her gaze drifted to the darkened staircase. She suspected the next move would come soon, and she meant to be ready for it. Would you like me to carry the story forward into the final reveal, where Miss Marple gathers everyone, forces the tension to its breaking point, and draws the killer into exposing themselves? That's where all the threads will finally connect. You said the pattern emerges, 1,000 to 1,000 to 200 words. Despite the chaos, a pattern starts to take shape. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, an offhand comment, a misplaced object, or an unusual habit, suddenly makes sense. The detective realizes that the key to the case has been in plain sight all along. ChatGPT said. The Crown Hotel had grown unnervingly still after Price's death. Guests stayed shut in their rooms, and even Green moved about the desk with quieter, almost furtive precision. Yet to Miss Marple, the quiet was not peace. It was the dangerous stillness before the next move. Inspector Crail, exhausted and frustrated, was bent over his notes in the lounge, muttering to himself. Felton in room 17, then Price in room 19. The missing notebook. Nothing ties together cleanly. If there's a pattern, I can't see it. Miss Marple, who had been quietly sorting her knitting bag, looked up mildly. Patterns, Inspector, are rarely visible when one is looking too closely at the individual threads. One must step back, just a little. She rose and drifted to the front desk. Green had just finished rearranging the mail rack for the second time that day. He muttered something about keeping things orderly and gave a thin smile. But Miss Marple's eyes weren't on his hands. They were on the items arranged there. Letters for guests neatly stacked, a single key lying slightly out of place, its brass tag turned the wrong way. Her mind moved back, almost absently, to an earlier moment. Green's habit of exacting order, his careful rearrangement of items, and something else. On the morning the evidence vanished, he had been here all the time. And yet Alice had seen Price near the desk unattended, which meant Green's claim wasn't entirely true. Miss Marple let her gaze pass on without comment, returning to her seat. She began knitting again, her needles clicking gently. In her mind, she was tracing the arrangement of events like a pattern in the wool. Felton had been killed in room 17. Door locked, a staged simplicity that hid complexity. A misleading envelope marked Brighton, perhaps intended to draw attention elsewhere. Price had died after the evidence vanished, someone silencing a man who might expose them. And all along, the hotel itself had been the one constant. Same rooms, same narrow corridors, same handful of people who could move unseen. Her needles paused for just a fraction of a second as the thought slid neatly into place. It was not only the rooms, but the sequence, the proximity. Room 17, room 19. And in between them, room 18. Empty on a paper, according to the register, yet always suspiciously unspoken of. A perfect place for someone to observe, to act unseen, to hide what needed hiding. She glanced at Crail. Inspector, have you happened to check the occupancy of room 18? Crail frowned. It's unoccupied. Has been for weeks. Maintenance, apparently. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind smile that so often concealed sharper thoughts. My dear Inspector, rooms marked as maintenance are rather like locked boxes. People often overlook them, and yet they are so very useful for someone who wishes to move about unnoticed. Crail straightened at once. You think the killer's been using it? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that when we examine that room, we may find certain familiar objects that have been missing of late, and perhaps the explanation for why our murderer always seems just a step ahead. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Green, who had stopped rearranging the mail rack, his movements suddenly stiffer. In that moment, the pattern was no longer hidden. The murders were not random, nor were the actions of the killer desperate improvisation. Every move had been calculated, every disappearance of evidence deliberate. And the path to each crime, like the quiet key on the desk, had been in plain sight from the beginning. Miss Marple set down her knitting, the faintest glimmer of resolve in her eyes. Inspector, I believe it's time we had a look at that room. Room 18 had not been opened in weeks, or so Green had claimed. Yet when Crail's key turned in the stiff lock, the stale air inside told a different story. Dust lay undisturbed only on the edges, the center of the room bearing scuffed marks of movement. A chair had been dragged toward the window, from which one could see directly into the corridor between rooms 17 and 19. In the wardrobe, Crail found what Miss Marple had quietly expected, the missing notebook, a stack of correspondence bearing Felton's name, and a glass bearing a faint residue that made the inspector mutter darkly about poisons. Crail rounded on Green immediately, but Miss Marple's gentle voice intervened. "Not quite yet, Inspector. We must understand why. People rarely risk everything without a reason far stronger than convenience." The guests were summoned to the lounge once more, the atmosphere thick with apprehension. Green stood near the door, pale but defiant. Mrs. Talbot wrung her hands nervously, while Alice sat rigid, her eyes darting toward the desk where Green normally presided. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension with precision. "The pattern of these crimes has been carefully arranged. Felton in room 17, Price in room 19, both deaths connected by what was hidden in this very hotel. But the true question has always been motive, not greed alone, not fear alone. Something deeper." She looked toward Green, but her words floated over the whole room. "Felton, we now know, was not merely a guest. He was a blackmailer. His victims were not few, and the most recent of these was a man with access, opportunity, and a desperate need to keep the past buried." Green's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her words grew sharper. "Years ago, Mr. Green, you were not a hotel clerk. You were part of a small investment firm, one that collapsed in scandal after certain funds went missing. A young man took the blame and vanished, but Felton had found the truth. He knew you were here. He knew you could pay, or be ruined." There was a long, taut silence. Crail blinked in surprise. "This is about an old fraud?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Fraud is only the surface. This was about identity, Inspector. Mr. Green has built an entirely new life, a respectable life, one he could not afford to lose. Money could be replaced. Reputation could not. Felton threatened to destroy not only his safety, but the illusion that allowed him to remain free." Green's voice came low and strained. "I had no choice. He'd have dragged me back into it. Everything I've built here, gone." Miss Marple's eyes were steady, almost kind. "And Price?" He too had seen something in that notebook. Perhaps a name, perhaps a date, that told him your secret. You silenced him because the past, once awakened, could not be put back to sleep." The room was utterly still now, the weight of the truth settling over it. Crail stepped forward, but Miss Marple spoke once more, her tone softer. "It is always the same, Mr. Green. People go to extraordinary lengths to protect not just what they have, but who they believe they are. The crime was never only about blackmail or evidence. It was about holding on to the only identity you thought could keep you safe." Green's shoulders slumped, the tension draining from him. For the first time he looked older, smaller, as if the years he had outrun had finally caught up with him. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in the silence. The deeper motive had been revealed. Not greed, but fear of losing the self he had so carefully constructed. And it was that fear, more than anything, that had driven him to murder. The lounge of the Crown Hotel was heavy with the kind of silence that comes just before a storm breaks. All the guests had been gathered, the doors guarded by 2 uniformed constables. Crail stood near the hearth, watchful, but it was Miss Marple who commanded the room, quietly, as always. She sat in her usual armchair, knitting in her lap, speaking with that deceptively mild tone. "We have had 2 deaths in this hotel, both men connected by a certain notebook, and by one other thing. Both deaths, though seemingly separate, followed a path that began in the past and wound its way into this very place." Her eyes drifted toward Green. He stood at the far end of the room, hands folded behind his back, trying for calm, but with a rigidity that betrayed him. Miss Marple's voice continued, as if she were merely explaining a household puzzle. "Felton, who died in room 17, had been a blackmailer. Price, in room 19, had stumbled across proof of that blackmail and something more. Both were silenced because they held a truth someone could not risk being revealed. And that someone... She let the pause hang, the tension drawing everyone tighter. Had every opportunity to move unnoticed through these halls, every reason to wish that past troubles never saw the light again. Green's mouth opened slightly, perhaps to protest, but Miss Marple's words moved faster now, weaving the net. We searched room 18, supposedly closed for maintenance. We found the notebook there, hidden alongside papers from your former life, Mr. Green. You have been clever, yes, but cleverness cannot erase a pattern once it is seen. 2 murders, missing evidence, a false identity maintained for years, all threads that lead back to you. Green's jaw tightened. This is absurd. I've done nothing. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice sharpened. Then perhaps you will explain how your fingerprints came to be on the glass that poisoned Mr. Price, or why you were the only one with keys to room 18. Or perhaps you will explain why Felton's last known letters, addressed to a name you once used, were found in your possession. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Then Green's composure cracked. You don't understand. He would have ruined me. I built everything here, everything, from nothing. I wasn't going to let him take it. Crail stepped forward, but Green's eyes darted to the door. For a fleeting second, the tension shifted. Would he try to run? Miss Marple did not rise from her chair, but her voice stopped him like a lock on a door. There's nowhere to go, Mr. Green, and running would only confirm what we already know. You've lived a life built on concealment. Tonight is the night it ends. Green's shoulders sagged. His last reserve drained away as he slumped into a chair. I never meant for Price to die. Felton, yes, but Price... He got curious. I panicked. I just wanted it all to go away. Crail moved in to take him, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Green a moment longer. Her voice was soft, almost pitying. The trouble with the past, Mr. Green, is that it rarely stays where we put it. It waits quietly until the right moment to step into the present. As the constables led him away, the tension in the room finally eased. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the sound of her needles a quiet metronome against the fading drama. The storm had broken, and the Crown Hotel was at last still again. Would you like me to write the resolution and aftermath, 1,000 to 1,200 words, showing how Miss Marple explains the full sequence of events, ties together every clue, and restores order after the chaos? This would give the story its satisfying closing chapter. You said the last-minute twist, 1,000 to 1,200 words. Just when everything seems resolved, a final revelation shakes things up. Perhaps the real mastermind was someone unexpected, or the case isn't as open and shut as it appeared. The detective's genius is tested one last time. ChatGPT said the Crown Hotel exhaled a long, collective breath after Green's removal. Guests began to drift back to their rooms, eager to be done with whispered fears and locked doors. Inspector Crail, for the first time in days, allowed himself a weary smile. Case closed, Miss Marple. Clean as they come. 2 murders, 1 culprit, all the evidence wrapped up neatly. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair, resumed her knitting. Clean as they come, she repeated softly, though her voice held no conviction. Her pale eyes wandered to the desk, where Alice, the maid, stood watching Green's departure. There was something about her expression, not relief, but a peculiar stillness. That stillness lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she retired for the evening. But rest did not come easily. The pattern she had so carefully pieced together held, yet a small thread refused to lie flat. It was in the morning, over a pot of tea in the lounge, that the thread began to tug. Crail arrived, holding a fresh report. We found more in room 18, hidden bank slips, an old letter. It confirms Green's past. There's no doubt now. Miss Marple accepted the information with a mild nod, but her mind wandered back to something Alice had said the very first day. "I thought I heard someone moving between the rooms." At the time, it seemed like the nervous fancy of a servant unused to scandal. But now, paired with the faint scent of lavender that had lingered in room 18 when they opened it. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to have Miss Alice brought here?" Alice arrived a few minutes later, her hands twisting her apron. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly. "It must have been very frightening, my dear, working in the midst of such dreadful events. You knew Mr. Green would take the blame, of course, but you must have worried, just a little, that someone might discover your own part in it." Alice's face went pale. My part? I didn't—" Miss Marple's tone was soft, but unrelenting. "Felton's blackmail wasn't limited to Mr. Green. You see, he had another hold on you, a secret from your time at the Brighton Hotel, where certain valuables disappeared. You were young, frightened, and he promised to keep it quiet, for a price. When Mr. Green became his primary target, you saw an opportunity. All you had to do was help him along. A quiet word about who occupied which room, a key left in the right place, a little something slipped into a drink." Alice's eyes widened, her voice trembling. "You can't prove—" But Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her words were edged with steel. "My dear, the scented handkerchief we found in room 18, marked with your initials, is quite proof enough. And of course, the faint lavender on the desk drawer where the notebook had been hidden. That is a fragrance you wear every day. I dare say the inspector will find more than enough to confirm the rest." Creel's mouth opened in shock. "You're saying she—" Miss Marple gave the faintest nod. "Green was guilty, yes. But he was not alone in guilt. He was convenient. Alice made certain of that. A clever young woman, setting the stage so that when the curtain fell, she would be free of Felton's blackmail forever, and of suspicion as well." Alice's voice broke, her defiance crumbling. "I just wanted it to end. He was ruining my life." Miss Marple's expression softened, but there was no triumph in her voice. "My dear, murder never ends what we think it will. It only changes the shape of the trouble." As Alice was led away, Creel shook his head. "Two of them all along. You never stop surprising me, Miss Marple." She picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking quietly. "Evil is rarely tidy, Inspector. We may catch it, but there are always threads left to weave back into place." The Crown Hotel had settled into a strained quiet after Alice's arrest, though a certain unease still lingered in the corridors. Guests avoided room 17. The staff spoke in hushed tones, and Inspector Creel paced the lounge like a man trying to convince himself the case was truly over. Miss Marple, as ever, sat quietly by the fire, her knitting in hand. Creel approached at last, shaking his head. "I can't quite believe it. Two culprits working toward the same end, neither knowing the other's full hand. I'd have sworn Green was acting alone." Her needles clicked gently. "It is an easy assumption, Inspector. Most crimes look solitary until you see where the patterns overlap." Creel sat down heavily. "Perhaps you'd explain it all?" "I've the facts, but the picture, I'd like to hear it in order." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Of course, Mr. Felton was a blackmailer, skilled but greedy. He'd been pressing Mr. Green for years, ever since Green's rather sudden rise in the hotel trade. Felton knew Green's real identity, and that knowledge was worth quite a sum. At the same time, he had another, smaller victim in Alice. She was not a hardened criminal, merely a girl who made a foolish mistake in Brighton. Something Felton could hold over her indefinitely. Now, when Felton came to the Crown Hotel, he saw both his targets in one place. His arrogance blinded him to the risk. He demanded a higher payment from Green and threatened Alice anew. What he did not realize was that each of them, for different reasons, had decided they could not allow him to continue. Creel leaned forward. So they each plotted murder, without the other knowing. Precisely. Green had the means to poison Felton's drink, having ready access to the bar and the knowledge of the man's habits. But Alice, who cleaned the rooms, arranged the meeting in such a way that Green's plan would succeed unnoticed. She slipped him small opportunities, believing herself merely helping fate along. When Mr. Price stumbled upon Felton's notes, matters became dangerous. He guessed enough to be a threat. Green acted swiftly to silence him, believing the blame would fall on Felton's death alone. Alice, meanwhile, saw her chance to rid herself of the incriminating notebook entirely and place it where suspicion would rest squarely on Green. That was her error. The handkerchief, the lavender, small things but telling. Crail frowned. And the stolen evidence, the altered reports. Ah, yes, Miss Marple said gently. Alice again. In the confusion, she thought removing certain papers would safeguard her. In fact, it drew my attention. People rarely destroy evidence unless they fear it points to them. Crail exhaled slowly. So justice is done. Green will hang, and Alice will face trial. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Justice of a kind, Inspector. Green will face the law, certainly. But Alice, she is young, frightened, and perhaps the court will be lenient. Whether justice is served or escapes us somewhat, that is not for us to decide. She picked up her knitting once more, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. The important thing, Inspector, is that truth is served. We cannot always choose the manner in which justice arrives. Crail stood, still troubled but satisfied enough. I'll see to the paperwork, and perhaps when you next come to St. Mary Mead, you'll find a quieter holiday. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One can always hope, Inspector, but one must never expect it. As he departed, the firelight danced across the room. The storm had passed. The case was closed, or as closed as such matters ever are. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the flames, knowing the past never stays buried forever. Somewhere, in some quiet place, another pattern was already forming. The Crown Hotel's halls had grown quieter, yet silence did not bring peace. The guests, who had been so quick to rush away from scandal, now lingered just long enough to satisfy their curiosity. They watched Miss Marple with sidelong glances, as though the frail old lady might suddenly reveal one last hidden secret. Inspector Crail, his papers signed and his prisoners in custody, gave her a final nod. That's the end of it, I suppose. Green's confession seals his fate, and Alice, well, the court will do as it sees fit. I can't thank you enough, Miss Marple. She smiled her gentle, unassuming smile. I'm quite sure you'd have sorted it in time, Inspector, but sometimes patterns are clearer to those who have the leisure to look closely. With that, she gathered her knitting bag and hat. A hansom cab was waiting to take her to the station. The rain had stopped, but the cobblestones were slick, the air sharp with the scent of the sea. As she stepped into the cab, she cast one last glance toward the hotel windows. Inside, life would go on. New guests, fresh linens, polished silver, but room 17 would always carry its whisper of scandal. The cab rattled down the winding road, the sound of the surf fading. Miss Marple sat back, her mind as calm as her face. And yet, something tugged at her thoughts. It was a small thing, hardly worth troubling over. The hotel register. She remembered the names, written in the neat hand of the clerk. Felton, Green, Price, and one other. A Mr. Henry Fortescue, who had checked in 2 days before Felton's death. A quiet man, polite, who kept largely to himself. He had departed the morning after the murders began, without fuss or attention. No one had suspected him of anything. There had been no reason. And yet, she remembered the moment she'd first walked past room 19, the faint scent of pipe smoke drifting from within, and a small brass button glinting in the hallway. At the time, she had thought it belonged to one of the porters, a button not unlike the kind on Green's old hotel uniform. Miss Marple's hands folded over her knitting bag. She did not frown. Her face remained as serene as ever. The pattern was complete, yes, but some threads had been tied off too neatly. As the cab approached the station, she looked out at the grey sweep of the sea. Somewhere, perhaps far from here, Mr. Fortescue was reading the morning paper, smiling faintly over his breakfast. The world, Miss Marple knew, was full of Feltons and Greens, and of quiet men who left no trace except for the faint scent of smoke and a single misplaced button. The train whistle echoed in the distance. Miss Marple stepped down from the cab, her ticket in hand. The case of room 17 was over, at least officially. But mysteries, she reflected, never truly ended. Some simply waited. And with that, she boarded the train, the countryside rolling away behind her. Somewhere ahead, another pattern waited to be unraveled.